I'm Charlie McLeod. This is my colleague Wolfgang Kaiser. We're going to be talking about the Pro SDK and configurations. So what is a configuration? It's a new extensibility pattern we introduced at 1.4. We like to think of it as having all of the functionality of an add-in plus some additional capabilities, such as the ability to change the application title and icon, customize the splash and start page, and as we'll see, some conditional customization of the UI, perhaps based on user permission or role or portal group membership, that kind of thing. And we'll see all of these in the session. Okay, when you install the Pro SDK, and in Visual Studio, you will see this template, this project template called ArcGIS Pro Managed Configuration. So that's the guide that you actually use to create a brand new configuration. And when you compile and build your configuration, it makes an archive file just like an add-in, except it has a .pro config_x suffix. Uses the same Xcopy or double-click deployment as add-ins do. They're deployed to the C user's public documents folder. Add-ins are deployed to your C user's username documents folder. You can have multiple configurations deployed on a machine, but only one configuration can be run per instance of Pro. And the way you specify which configuration to run is with this /config command line argument, followed by the name of the configuration. So in this case, as shown on the slide, we're running a configuration called Acme. Let's just take a quick look at a couple of those things. I'm just going to go to Visual Studio. All right. So I've run the template. So File, New, Project. There's the ArcGIS Pro add-ins. There's the two templates, one for add-in, one for configuration. I've run the configuration template, and once it's finished, your Solution Explorer will look like this. Config.daml, a module, that's the same as an add-in, so no difference there. There's a new class called Configuration Manager. We'll be talking about that guy extensively. And then there's also this folder UI, and that's different from add-ins too. And in that UI folder, we see that there's this about page you can customize, a splash screen, and then this start page that you can use, out of the box. Okay. To give you an idea of some of the start pages and customizations you can do with the configuration, I'm running this demo. It's a sample actually that you can download from our Pro SDK samples. And it's called Config WithStartWizard. And it has a start page that is basically a gallery of start pages. This particular start page we're looking at is the stock generated start page you get when you run the template. No customizations. It's just showing the recently opened list of projects, and then you can pick one and use that to initiate the session. Here is another example start page. This one replicates the stock start page of Pro. Might be useful if you want to show something that looks very similar to the stock start page, but you perhaps want to customize just some little aspect of its behavior. This is a completely different type of start page. Here we're writing a start page that actually accesses online, and we're accessing project packages, and we're going to use one of those to initiate the session. Same idea, could be project templates. Could even do a start page using web maps. Maybe even map services, feature services, any of those are possible. Now here is a completely different kind of start page. Let's just say, for sake of argument, that we work for an organization where our users work in particular areas of geography. In this case, let's just say counties of California. And so in their start experience, we want them to pick the particular county that they're going to work in to initiate the session. So anyway, this is a sample. It's available online. Just give you an idea of some of the start page customizations you can do with the configuration. Okay? All right, let's go back to the slides. All right, so for the purposes of this session, let's assume that we're challenged with writing a particular configuration for a group of users in our organization. And they work with addresses or IDs or something, but something that requires a geocode. And after they've done that geocode, we're going to provide them some kind of tool set, some custom functionality that they're going to use at each particular geocoded location. And we want to customize the Pro application to support that workflow. So we'll step through some of the basics first, like the splash, start, and about page, name and icon. We'll add in some custom feature functionality. We'll pick it up a notch, and we'll get into the backstage, how to customize and streamline the backstage. And then we'll get into some more advanced customizations at the conclusion of the session, where we'll do conditional customization, where depending on the user that logs in and runs our configuration, we'll use the same configuration to show a completely different look depending on who logs in. All right, so basics first. The most important class in a configuration is the configuration manager, okay? It's defined in DAML, and so when you run the template, you'll see that the template defines this configuration element, and then this configuration manager child element with a class name attribute that points to the code behind file that contains the implementation of the configuration manager. The configuration manager itself provides a series of callbacks, each of which overrides some different aspect of Pro. Okay, so perhaps splash screen, start page, and about page. To override any particular aspect, you implement that callback, okay? Now they're all optional, so if, for example, you don't want to override some particular behavior in Pro, then you simply don't implement that override or delete it, return null. So they're all optional. These are all optional aspects of Pro that you can override. We'll see a lot of the configuration manager. So splash screen first. Splash screen, it's a window, system.windows.window. Easiest thing to do is to simply modify the splash screen that we give you with the template. If you want to write your own, you can. Pro uses a splash screen with a 2:1 width to height aspect ratio. And once you've implemented your splash screen, you simply override this on-show splash screen callback. This code here is copy-pasted directly out of the automatically generated code you get when you run that template, okay? You see, we're just returning an instance of the splash screen as the return argument to this callback. Something to be aware of when you're working with configurations that you don't have to be aware of when you're writing add-ins. Some of these callbacks occur super early in the startup sequence of Pro. In fact, so early that in many cases, the resources for the Pro application haven't been loaded yet. So in splash screen, you don't want to use any of the Pro SDK styles or resources in your splash screen, just strictly the generic Windows or WPF resources. The Pro resources haven't been loaded yet. In fact, the application window itself hasn't been instantiated when the show splash screen callback is initiated. Start page. So start page is a user control view model pair, uses the same MVVM pattern as you're probably familiar with in add-ins. The start page is shown at the conclusion of the Pro initialization. Now your start page is shown only once, okay? Shown once at the beginning of the session. And if you choose to provide a start page, then you're taking responsibility for initiating the session. And you can initiate a session in one of two ways. You can either create a new project, or you can open an existing project. Once you've started the session, you don't have to worry about closing the start page. Pro does that for you automatically. Since 1.4, we've been supporting two themes, light and dark and high contrast mode. So ideally, if you do provide a custom start page, you would support the light and dark theme and the high contrast mode styling as well, okay? If you implement a start page, you override the on-show start page callback. Once again, This code comes right out of the template-generated code. You see we're making an instance of our start page view model, our start page user control. We set the view model to the data context of the user control. This is just standard MVVM. And then we return the instance of our user control as a return argument of this callback. Somewhere else, this start page is initiating the session by opening a project. That's what we're showing here. About name and icon. So the about page, that's appropriate where you want to put perhaps copyright statement, the name of your organization, whatever information you feel is relevant to be added to the about page of Pro. And you can additionally override the application name that's shown on the toolbar, and then the application icon that's in the upper left. We'll see all of these. Configuration is an add-in. So all of the templates that come with the Pro SDK that you use to write your add-ins, you can also use to provide your custom feature functionality for your workflows. So the buttons, the tools, combo boxes, doc panes, property sheets, so on and so forth. Just use the out-of-the-box SDK templates to add those to your configuration. All right, so let's take a look at our configuration then. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. And here in Visual Studio, I have run that configuration template. You see those same stock files that I got, when I showed that previous configuration. The config.daml, the module, our configuration manager class, and then our starter about page, splash screen, about page, splash screen, and then our start page user control and view model. I've gone ahead and added this geocode folder. And into this geocode folder, I've already added some custom feature functionality that we're going to use to build our configuration. Okay? I got a about page, and I've added, we just added some text, saying, okay, this is the name of our configuration, some kind of copyright, the name of the company we work for, and so forth. Here I've got a user control, this geocode UI. This is our geocode user control. It's got a simple text field. We're going to type in our address, and then the find location button. When you push it, it'll initiate the geocode. Okay. Here's our custom start page. On that custom start page, I've cited that geocode UI user control, and then I've added our company logo with some kind of branding and color scheme. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is I want to hook up these custom components to Pro. And to do that, I'm going to use that configuration manager class. Okay? So let's take a look at that. So out of the box, it generates these stubs for startup page, splash, and about. In the startup page, I'm just simply going to change it to use, rather than the template start page view model, the one that we've written, the geocode. So I'm just going to change that guy there to our geocode start page view model. And then I'll just change the variable declaration up there. And then we don't want the start page, we want our geocode start page. And that's really all the code I have to change. We bind the view model to the view, and we return the user control from the onShow start page callback. Okay, so that's pretty much as is. The splash screen, I really didn't do a custom splash screen. I can take the stock one though, for example, and let's just go in there and say, put in our company name, like so. Go back to the configuration manager. And now our about page. So I don't want to use the template about page. I'm going to use our one, our geocode about page. Okay? So that's pretty much it. Just simply override those particular callbacks, returning our custom user content. The template also gives us this property for application name. I'm not going to bother changing that. And then it also gives us this placeholder icon, okay, that comes with the template. And we'll just use that one as well, okay? The last thing I want to do is I want to add in some custom functionality, representative of our workflow that we perform at the geocoded location. I'm just going to use the SDK templates. And I'm just going to add in a button. And I will call it a workflow button. Like so. It's not really important what it does. I'm just going to put in some sort of placeholder functionality. Okay, like so. I'm going to go into the config.daml file. So the template generated, here's our button it generated for us. Added this group. By default, it puts it on the add-in tab. I don't really want to use the add-in tab, so I'm just going to delete that. Okay. And then it also stubs out for us this particular tab here, and I'm going to use that guy. So I'm just going to uncomment this. So, and I'm going to call our tab custom. Okay. All right. Let's just build that. And let's run it. Okay, so here's our custom splash, name of our company, Acme Electric. Pro starts, it's showing our custom start page. It's got our geocode UI user control cited on it, company logo, branding, and whatnot. Okay, now I'm just going to accept this default address. We'll initiate the geocode. Under the covers, it's using the online geocoder. It's not really important for the purposes of this session. Zoom centers the map on the geocoded location. We go to our custom tab. I do the work necessary for that particular location. Okay, like so. Let's go to the Backstage tab. First, here's my About page. There's that About information that's been added into Pro. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to show on the Backstage is that we have these two tabs here, New and Open. Notice that they're still using the stock out-of-the-box New and Open experience. For us, our users, they do geocodes, okay? And so we don't want our users to have the stock New and Open. We want to kind of continue that geocoding metaphor onto the Backstage. So if they're already in a session, we want them to open or initiate, the next session using that same kind of metaphor. So let's see how we're going to go about doing that. And then additionally, we want to get rid of this existing New and Open Backstage tab as well. Okay. Let's go back to the slides. And let's customize Backstage then. We want to provide this custom experience using the same geocode metaphor we used on the start page. And then we want to get rid of the stock New and Open because we don't want our users dealing directly with projects. Providing the custom Backstage tab, that's easy. It's just like in an add-in. Just run the Backstage tab template, okay, and then customize it to our particular need. To delete the tabs, we've actually got a couple of ways we can do it. So same as an add-in, we could just use DAML. So DAML's transactional. You can do inserts, updates, and deletes. So I could simply write the DAML to delete those tabs off the Backstage. Configurations, though, give us this additional capability to actually implement these UI changes in code. And to do that, there's another override called OnUpdateDatabase. And let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so in the Configuration Manager class, there's this OnUpdateDatabase callback. And the way it works is this. When Pro starts up, it reads the XML user interface definitions from all of the extensions and all of the add-ins that you have installed on your particular machine. And it consolidates all of that DAML into a single XML database that represents the entire user interface of Pro. That database is passed to you as the argument to the OnUpdateDatabase callback. You can modify that XML database to whatever purpose you require. In this particular case, we're selecting from that database all of the tab elements. I'm looping through that enumeration, and I'm selecting from it tabs that have some particular identifier component. I'm adding them to this collection, and then at the conclusion of that loop, I am deleting those elements from that collection. So I'm filtering out some tabs, and then I'm deleting them, okay? So let's see how to do this. Back to our geocode configuration. So the first thing we have to do is we have to add our custom Backstage tab. So to do that, I'm just going to run the standard Backstage tab template, okay? Our new Backstage tab, run it, template runs. It generates our Backstage tab user control, our Backstage tab view model. So let's customize the Backstage tab user control first. I'm just going to go in the XAML, and then I just want to add in our same geocode UI user control. Cite that on the page, okay? It has an address attribute. And I'm going to bind that to an address attribute in our view model, which we have yet to define. Okay? So I'm just simply citing our geocode UI user control. I go into the Backstage tab view model. And this is the code that the template generated for me. It gives us this tab heading out of the box. I'm just going to change that title to be geocode. Okay? And then I'm going to use this same property here to make that address property that we were binding to back in the user control. I'll just change this to be address. Okay. I'll change the name of the property to be address. We'll give it some kind of default address, like so. And then all I've really got to do else here is kind of fix this copy-paste baggage. Address, okay? So that's our Backstage tab. We have a new Backstage tab. I've hosted our geocode user control on it. I'm going to go to the DAML. Okay, we see when we ran that Backstage tab template, it kind of generated this XML definition here. When you run that Backstage tab template, you actually get a button and a tab. So on Backstage, not everything is a tab. For example, the save and exit, they're buttons. So we actually get a button too. I don't need it, so I'm just going to delete it. I'm not using it. I'm going to change the caption of the tab from Backstage tab 1 to be geocode. By default, when you add new tabs in with the template, they're placed at the bottom. I want to place ours at the top. So I'm going to place ours above the Save Project button. Okay, like so. Okay. The last thing we need to do is we need to remove that new and open Backstage tab. So I've added in my new Backstage tab. Now we need to strip off those two existing ones. Okay? So I'm going to go back to my Configuration Manager class. And then here is that OnUpdateDatabase callback. Okay? I've already got the code we need stubbed out here, so I'm just going to simply uncomment it. And then I'm going to explain what it's doing in the debugger while we're running the configuration. Custom splash screen. Okay, OnUpdateDatabase callback. All right, so here is that XML database I told you about. If we look at it in the debugger, we can see in here, here is that XML definition of the Pro UI. For example, here are all the pages, conditions, components, menus, buttons, tabs, groups. I mean, it's all in there, okay? So this is the user interface definition of Pro, okay? Collected from or consolidated from all of the DAML of all the extensions and add-ins. From that, I'm going to select all of the tabs. And then here we see in this loop, I'm looping through that enumeration, I want to find all of those tabs that are on the backstage, and specifically from them, the new and the open backstage tab, okay? And I'm going to add that into this collection here, okay? So here is, there's the new project backstage tab. There's the open project backstage tab. And then at the conclusion of that loop, right, I got them both. I'm just going to delete them, okay? Boom. Our configuration loads. There's a start page. We've seen that before. I'm going to accept the default. Default address location. Go to the address. We zoom. We center the map. I go to my custom workflow tab. I do the work necessary that needs to be performed at that location. I go to the backstage, okay. Now we've got our custom backstage tab. We've got the same geocode UI on it. So I go to my next address. Zoom center. I do my work at that location. I go back to the backstage. I go to my next address. Notice that the stock new and open have been deleted. They're no longer there. Then I continue. Wash, rinse, repeat. Address, work, backstage, address, boom, work, so on and so forth, okay? All right, so let's say that as designers of our configuration, it is our intent to provide all of the feature functionality that our users are going to require on our custom tab. And we want to streamline this UI further to remove all of the other tabs in the Pro UI, to include the hidden contextual tabs as well. We want to totally streamline the user interface. And to do that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Wolf. He'll step us through that process.
Thanks, Charlie. So I'm going to talk about some advanced topics about configurations. And as Charlie just alluded to, I talk about customization of the user interface by removing existing functions and tabs. And then we're going to go a little bit further. We do some conditional customization where we provide a different user interface depending on the permissions of the users that are running Pro. And we can do that based on Active Directory role, or as we do in our example, we can use ArcGIS portal roles and query those to determine permissions. Finally, I'm going to show what we reference as the filter command functionality via the command filter. That's one of the options we have through Configuration Manager. And this allows us to filter buttons, tools, menus, etc. that are on the ribbon specifically for their behavior. So let's start with customizing the user interface. Removing existing functions and tabs. So you see on the top right a standard out-of-the-box ArcGIS Pro interface. You have the project, the map, the insert tab, the analysis tab, view tab, edit tab. And in a lot of use cases, that's a little bit overwhelming for some of our users that want to perform a specific custom workflow. So on the bottom, you see just a custom workflow that we are specifically interested in. The user interface is much simplified and streamlined. We only have two tabs. We have a custom workflow tab that shows us our specific workflow functions, and then an editing tab. So as Charlie showed us before, we have the OnUpdateDatabase method that we can override, and we revisit this to make these modifications. We could also modify the UI via DAML that Charlie also showed, but in this case, it's more preferable to use code because that allows us to change functionality using wildcard patterns. So here's this method from the configuration manager on OnUpdateDatabase. And in this one, we delete all unwanted tabs. So changes are made to the XAML, the XML, the DAML configuration of all user interface elements, and these are propagated back to the Pro UI. You can see on the top of the method, we have we get all the tab elements that we are interested in. Then we actually loop through every single one of these tab elements. Few house cleaning calls here to make sure that nothing goes wrong. But specifically, we look for the backstage. And again, we want to remove the new and the open project backstage tabs. So this way, we have the same functionality that Charlie just showed. And then finally, at the very end, we exclude our own tabs, the geocode configuration tabs, from removal, but we remove everything else. We also want to make sure that the users don't go behind the scenes and use some of the customization to add tabs that we have removed back into the system. So this can actually be done via the option customization, customize the ribbon dialog, which you see on the right side here. So we want to disable this function, and to disable the customize the ribbon option, we have a tag under the configuration manager tag. It's called block customize dialog. And if we set this attribute to true, that will disable that option. Now the customize the ribbon option is not available anymore. And down here you see the specific DAML tag, the configuration tag. Here's the block customize dialog attribute set to true, and here's our configuration manager reference. We'll see that in a second in our sample. Okay, and here we go. So what we're going to do is I remove, as you can see on the left side here, all the extraneous tabs that I don't need for my workflow. So this is the same geocode configuration that Charlie showed us earlier. We also have the modified startup screen that allows us to find the location via geocode and then starts the application. However, the difference now is once the application starts, we want to only have the tabs that we are specifically interested in our workflow. So this is done, as I said earlier, in the OnUpdateDatabase method. And I'm going to set a breakpoint right here. And as we debug through this, I'll show you how this all occurs. So let me start the application. I modified the startup screen a little bit. I have to log into my portal sign-in. I really don't need this here because I'm not interested in roles, but just for the heck of it, I just signed in. So here's my, here are my tab elements that I extracted from the user interface, definitions. And now I step through every single one. So here would be our first tab element. This would be just our new project backstage tab. So if I set a breakpoint in here, you can see that all my tabs that have a parent of Backstage will fall into this if condition here. And if they're specifically new projects and open projects, I will remove them, otherwise I leave them. And the same happens down here. If my own tabs all start with an ID called geocode configuration. So these ones I leave in the system, everything else I remove. So let's continue running this. Here's my startup screen. So here's my first location. I find this location. And ArcGIS Pro opens with a user interface. And as you can see on the top, my user interface has been streamlined to my workflow. All I have left is my custom editing tab and my custom workflow tab. So this is specifically my workflow. Here, for example, is a functionality that I implemented through a geoprocessing task that finds power poles that are further than 50 meters away from my service roads. So if I click on this, the geoprocessing task would be executed. You can see on the right side, here's my two candidates that fulfill that condition. I can click on these. I can now start editing, so I can click on editing. And this is the workflow that I would have to do. And the user interface has been streamlined to only the functions that I need to do for this specific work. So back to the slides. So now we want to perform a conditional customization. So what we want to do, we want to provide a different user interface depending on the permissions of the user running Pro. So for this demo, we use ArcGIS Online Group Membership. And I have two user accounts that I set up for this. One is called Demo Pro SDK, and he is a member of two groups. One group is called For Editing. The second group is called For Viewing. So for this user, I want to show two tabs. I want to show my custom workflow tab. I also want to show the editing tab. My second user is called Demo Pro SDK 2. He is only member of For Viewing. So for this user, I want to disable the editing functionality. So I want to not show the editing tab at all. I want to hide that tab, and I want to disable editing functionality. So he sees only the custom workflow tab. So when I look at ArcGIS Online, I can bring this up. So when I look at the group membership, you can see this is my Pro SDK user 2. He only has one group that he's member of. My second user is member of two groups, For Editing and For Viewing. Okay, so let's see how this is done. So first of all, for the conditional customization, I need to find an entry point where I can query the information from ArcGIS Online. So there's two methods that I specifically am interested in, provided through the configuration manager. It's on application initializing and on application ready. These two key callbacks are important in respect to the configuration manager lifecycle. So on application initializing denotes to me that it's now safe to call portal. And on application denotes to me that it's now safe to call any of the Pro API functions. So since I want to interface with portal and find out my group membership, I use the onInitializing function and I override it. Specifically in this code snippet here, you can see I have a method that I wrote using API functionality to get the portal group memberships for the logon user. And I return this in a list of group names. And now I determine whether the user is an editor or not if his group names contain the string for editing. So also in the life cycle, the onCreateDaml method, I can use the onCreateDaml method to return a DAML string. So this would allow me to pre-configure my DAML that is determined by my user role, and then replace any DAML that's read from the our config.daml. So this is not in addition to the config.daml, this would completely replace it. Again, in here it's safe to call portal, and on application initializing has already occurred. So this is actually most appropriate for adding functionality conditionally. It's not really very appropriate to modify functionality. For that, again, we use the OnUpdateDatabase method. As we previously discussed, again, on application initializing has been called. We are past the complete DAML for the Pro UI, and based now on our portal query or Active Directory query, we can make modifications to the Pro DAML based on the user permissions. And we use OnUpdateDatabase to add, update, delete Pro functionality accordingly. So down here in that code snippet, you see it's very similar to what we saw before. Again, we go through all tabs, and depending on some string queries, we remove the tabs. Now specifically, I look for my geocode configuration edit tab, and if I'm not an editor, which at this point has been determined because on application initializing has been called before, so if I'm not an editor, then I remove the tab. Otherwise, I leave the configuration edit tab in there. Okay, now let's go and try this out. I have a second application. Let me rebuild this so we can actually see the screen. There we go. So again, we have the startup screen. It's very similar to before. However, we have some additional information on the startup screen where I actually display the user permissions. I also, in my configuration manager class, have overwritten the functionality in the startup, and I think I set a breakpoint, here it is, the on application initializing function, and this is where I actually query the portal for membership, and we store it in this list of strings with all the membership group member names. So let me run this application, we'll hit the breakpoints, and then we can look what's going on. So again, I have my custom splash screen. Okay, now you can see right after the splash screen disappeared, I have on application initializing being called. This is called before my startup screen. Let me step over this. So since I have to query the portal, I actually have to log into the portal. This is all handled by the API. So the API is smart enough to see that the current user is not logged in, so it actually asks the user to sign in. So I'm going to sign in with my user that only has viewing permissions, which is my Pro SDK 2 user. So now when I look at the group names, you can see he's only member of one group. And when I look specifically for the group, you can see it's the for viewing group. So he is not member of the for editing group, meaning that is editor will be set to false. So if I continue on this, now we come to the OnUpdateDatabase call, where again, as Charlie showed earlier, we get the whole DAML that's configured for our Pro UI passed in, and we actually go through all the tabs, and specifically, excuse me, we are interested in the configuration edit tab, and only if our current logged in user is not an editor, then we want to remove that tab. So let's run this. And we have hit that breakpoint because our current user does not have edit permissions. So let me continue. So also the startup screen, as I showed earlier, has the option, has now additional information it displays where we actually show the current user's permission. So this specific user has viewer permissions only. So if I now continue with my workflow, I find this location. So you can see it's zoomed to my location. I continue my workflow here. And as you can see, the edit option, the edit tab, is not visible for this user because this user only has viewing permission. I also modified the editing startup option that I had earlier to show me a string no permission. I could have also modified the UI not to show this editing button at all. Also, as I spoke to the configuration setting through the options configuration earlier, in this configuration, I actually did modify the options. So at the very bottom, you were able to customize your UI, but because I block the customization dialog, it's not visible, it's not an option for me now. So I cannot go in my user interface and through options, add the tabs that are disabled and hidden from me now back into the system. Yes, sir.
This technique, just the customization. When to hide the others, you have to get those particular property pages removed. Same as we remove the tabs. Same technique. And then add a tab? Put options on it? I think so. I haven't actually tried to do that. Yes. Yeah. Try and do that. I think it's possible.
So yeah, the question was whether we could modify the options dialog by adding additional options or disabling and removing options. And according to Charlie, this should be possible, but we haven't done it yet, so we might try that. That's actually a good, usage pattern. Okay, so this user was my view-only user. Now let me stop this. I exit out of here. And now I'm going to run the same configuration, but this time I log in with my user that has edit permissions. So I restart the application. I continue. And so this time I select my first user, Demo Pro SDK, which has both view and edit permissions. So again, we have the OnUpdateDatabase call. I still have the breakpoint where I remove the tab for editing, but this should not be hit at this point. Yeah, it skipped it because this user does have the edit permissions. And as you can see from the startup screen, it actually shows here's our current user, the Demo Pro SDK user, and it specifies that you do have edit permissions. So let me continue. And our user interface is now customized for the editor. So I can perform my custom workflow. And in addition to that, I can also start editing. And my custom editing tab is visible right here. So let me stop this, back to the slides. So finally, we're looking at the command filter function of the configuration manager. So this is used to prevent the execution of any relevant commands. So for example, we show an example where we just disable editing commands. So there's two overrides for commands. We have the onCanExecute command, which disables a command on mouse over and also on when it's initially displayed. And then we have the onExecute command, where we can prevent execution of a command when it's actually clicked by the user. So in both cases, the callback is passed the DAML ID of the relevant command, and then the filter code itself must determine whether that command is then enabled or executed or not. And here's an additional note, onApplicationReady has been called, so it's safe to access any API, any ArcGIS Pro API. So here's a little sample of a command filter. We are intercepting the behavior of existing ArcGIS Pro commands. Specifically in this example, we intercept onCanExecute, and we want to onCanExecute command. So we want to disable that command if the user doesn't have edit permissions. So you see in the code snippet to the left, we look at the command ID that gets passed into onCanExecute. And if it starts with Esri edit, and it just so happens that all commands in ArcGIS Pro, all command IDs that have anything to do with editing, all start with Esri_edit. So if we look for that pattern in those command strings, then we can say if our user is not an editor, then return false. Otherwise, we just return the default. And so what happens, as you see on the right side, all edit commands will be disabled, and that includes also the attribute table editor. So when you try to right-click on your attribute table, on your layer, on your feature layer, and edit the attribute table of that feature layer will be disabled. It says questions here, but let me show you the code snippet real quick. Command filter, build, rebuild. Let's take a look at the code itself. So here's command execute. You can see it's pretty much the same code that you just saw on the slides. I put a diagnostic output to see what kind of commands we receive here, and then I return false. So let me not set a breakpoint because we're gonna get quite a few commands that are coming in here. So let's run this. And then what I wanna do is I wanna display the output window on my debugger. So let me put this output window. Let me go to San Diego. I open San Diego. And I want to see my output window. And as you can see in the output window now, all the IDs that I receive, there's plenty of them, they all will be disabled, they all return false. So for example, Esri editing, grid set, origin, show attributes, table on, so anything that has Esri editing will be disabled. So now let me look at the app itself. So if I go to content and I look at my structures, I really should not be able to edit the attribute table. You see it's disabled because that would allow me to change attributes on this feature. So this was the command filter, which is the last advanced topic that I wanted to address here. And next we are at questions. Yes, sir?
Can you apply these both at the application level and project level, or are they pretty much just targeted towards the application and project level with the ArcGIS Pro?
It's at the application level.
So you can't do it at a project
there are many conditional customizations you can do. For example, which tabs are visible and that kind of thing. If you have criteria like, I only want these things to be visible when this particular project is open, I mean, that sort of stuff you would just code. There are things called conditions that you basically can set true or false. And you can define your own criteria for those, so that, that might be the example of how you go about doing that. Anything you do in OnUpdateDatabase, such as we were doing, like stripping the tabs, they're going to be gone. They're gone for that entire session, regardless of which, projects you open. So yeah, you need to do it in a slightly different fashion. Yeah. At the very back.
Yeah. So the module class is actually a singleton within your add-in and your configurations. So if you have any kind of static or global accessible property, you want to always put it into the module because it's accessible from everywhere.
Yeah.
So you still have the traditional Visual Studio template for doing a traditional added module. Is there any point in continuing that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, you could say in one regard that the configuration overlaps the add-in, but the configuration is really there to be a sort of very specific, purposeful, where you want to go beyond the customization of an add-in. Remember that there's only one configuration that can be run. And that configuration, may well interact with 10 add-ins. So, add-ins are per user, and obviously all of the add-ins that are on your machine, can be loaded, whereas your configurations, you're running one. So I think it would sort of be overkill to use a configuration for a couple of custom buttons. You could certainly do that. That would sort of be more, like the add-in. It's sort of like when you want to go beyond that, I would say. Yeah, it's a good question.
But also remember that your configuration only gets initiated when you utilize this command line syntax, with a /config and the name of your configuration. And this is meant so you can have multiple configurations active on your system, and depending on which icon you click, you start a specific configuration with a different name.
Similarly, you showed the example of taking a big application and slimming it down to just very narrow purpose.
Yes.
I assume that having done that, the memory footprint is just as big as it ever was. It's still the same full-size application.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you're really affecting that. There may be some, but I'd say that's probably right. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are there any more one-time parameters besides the config mode? So, for example, starting a specific project or...
Yep. You've got the thing, but if you bring up the Pro GitHub page, Wolf. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the documentation, but a lot of our documentation is on GitHub.
If you type into Google ArcGIS Pro SDK, you always get to this landing page. Yeah. And then if you click on documentation, it takes you to our GitHub documentation.
And just, go to the wiki, scroll down, and then one of those is command line arguments. Might be in the reference.
I think it's in the reference, yes. No. Let's see.
It's there, yeah, sorry. I don't have it immediately at my fingertips, but the answer to your question is yes.
There we go.
Okay.
Close call.
Yeah, so config, there's a few. Yep.
Can I put in some own command line arguments and then leave them in the application?
Yep. Just remember that the only one that's position dependent is the project. It expects the name of the project to be last. So if you add your own, then just make sure it's not last. We actually have I think one of those snippets on Framework is how to read your own command line arguments. You just use, in .NET, it's like environment.args. I think it's an enumeration, and then you just pull out your own. Yeah, it's just that would be stock.NET.
Yeah, it would be a framework snippet here somewhere where you can find that.
We have one there.
pattern.
I'll find it for you, but yes, that would be how you would do it. Just make sure it's not last. Yep.
There's actually a few add-ins that are available in ArcGIS Online that you can download, I think, for performance testing, and they do use command line parameters that they filter out themselves, and they use themselves for testing. And then if you're debugging and testing ArcGIS Pro, you're probably all familiar with the Control-Alt-M. That brings up the monitor, ArcGIS monitor, that shows you any kind of activity going on in ArcGIS, specifically if you have any problems with hanging background tasks, etc. That will help you a lot to debug that kind of information. Control-Alt-M.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.